As a native forest ranger, I've spent years protecting the forests of New Hampshire. My family has a long history of stewardship over these lands, a bond so deep that it's almost spiritual. Mount Washington, however, was a place I had always avoided. It wasn't the beauty or the challenge of the mountain that kept me away. It was the stories. Mount Washington has earned a reputation for being one of the most dangerous and unpredictable places on Earth. With its extreme weather and treacherous terrain, the mountain has claimed lives, and the locals are quick to speak of things far stranger than the weather. From eerie fogs to strange sounds in the night, Mount Washington has been the subject of countless paranormal rumors. I thought, being a seasoned ranger with experience in the forests, I could handle it. I knew the stories, but I believed in logic. I believed that the legends were just that, stories. But that belief would soon shatter that I was assigned to Mount Washington for what was supposed to be a routine shift, monitoring the trail conditions, keeping an eye on the weather, and ensuring that any hikers were safe. The first few days felt normal enough. The park was quiet, the sky clear, and the air crisp. But as night fell, the silence was overwhelming. There was an unnatural stillness that hung in the air, almost as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. The first strange incident happened on my third night. I was stationed at a cabin near the base of the mountain when I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was a hiker who had lost his way, but when I checked, no one was there. The snow was undisturbed. No footprints, nothing. I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched never left. It lingered in the back of my mind. By the end of the week, I had heard other reports from hikers. Some had seen strange lights in the sky. Others reported hearing voices calling out to them from the forest at night. I found this hard to believe, especially when I had never experienced anything like it myself. But as the days wore on, the atmosphere on the mountain grew heavier. The air became thick with an inexplicable tension. Then, on the 10th night, it happened. I was alone in the cabin, reading through my reports when I heard the voice. It was faint at first, like the wind playing tricks on me, but it quickly became clearer. A woman's voice, calling out in distress, "Help me! Help me!" I immediately grabbed my flashlight and ran outside, heart pounding in my chest. There was no sign of anyone nearby. The wind was howling, but no footsteps were in the snow. I yelled out, "Is anyone there?" My voice cracked in the cold night air, but there was nothing, only silence. That was the beginning. The mountain had started to reveal its darker side, and I realized too late that I had made a grave mistake by coming here. Mount Washington is not just a place on the map. It's a living, breathing entity that commands respect. The mountain looms over the surrounding landscape like an ancient guardian, its peak often shrouded in a mysterious veil of fog. It is known for the harshness of its weather, with winds that can exceed 100 miles per hour, temperatures that plummet without warning, and the sudden, suffocating fogs that can make even the most experienced climbers lose their way. But the mountain's dangers go beyond what's natural. There are stories that have been passed down for generations, stories that I had always dismissed as myths. The indigenous tribes who once called these mountains home spoke of spirits that dwelled in the forest, entities that protected the land from those who sought to exploit it. They believed the mountain was sacred, its vastness hiding secrets that no human should ever uncover. These stories were ingrained in the culture, and while I wasn't superstitious, I couldn't ignore the fact that something felt off. I grew up in New Hampshire, surrounded by its dense forests. I knew the woods as well as my own skin. My father had been a ranger before me, and I had been trained in every aspect of forest life. I learned to track animals, navigate through the wilderness, and interpret the signs of the land. But there was something about Mount Washington that felt different. It was a place where nature was untamable, even hostile. Over the years, I had heard the whispers of colleagues who had worked in the area. They spoke of strange encounters in the wilderness, hikers disappearing, never found again. A heavy silence that blanketed the forest, followed by strange sightings, like figures lurking in the periphery of vision, or lights in the sky that didn't belong. Some claimed to have heard voices on the wind, calling out from the dark. As a young ranger, I dismissed these stories. I chalked them up to overactive imaginations or the fear of the unknown. But the older I got, the more I realized that these weren't just stories. They were warnings. My first experience with the unexplainable came in my early years as a ranger. A simple hike through the woods turned into something that has haunted me ever since. I had been walking the trail near the base of the mountain, just another regular patrol, when I heard a rustling in the bushes. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too controlled. It was almost as if something was following me. I turned around several times, but each time, nothing was there. I remember the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I was trained to notice these things, whether it was an animal, another person, or simply the wind shifting. But this was different. The feeling of being stalked was overwhelming. It was as though the mountain itself was watching me, waiting. I couldn't shake the sensation. Every time I turned around, there was a fleeting shadow just out of sight. My flashlight swept over the area, but there was nothing. I hurried back to the station, feeling the weight of the mountain bearing down on me. The sense of being followed remained, even after I had returned to the safety of my cabin. And then there were the voices. Over the years, I had heard of others who had experienced the same thing. The faint whisper of a voice in the wind, a plea for help. I used to think it was just the sound of the mountain, the wind tricking the ears, creating the illusion of voices in the air. But after that night, I began to wonder if there was something more to it. Mount Washington is a paradox. It's both a place of beauty and a place of danger. Its rugged slopes are covered in lush forests, cascading streams, and quiet lakes, offering an idyllic escape from the outside world. But there is a darkness that lingers beneath the surface, a sense that something is always just out of sight, just beyond reach. I spent years working as a ranger, and during that time, I came to understand the rhythms of the mountain. I knew when it was safe to climb, when the weather would change, and when the mountain demanded respect. But I never understood its deeper mysteries. The mountain holds its secrets close, and as I spent more time on Mount Washington, I began to see those secrets in ways that I couldn't explain. One night, I was alone on the trails again. It was late, the kind of quiet night when even the wind seemed to sleep. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, as if the forest was holding its breath. I had just finished checking the trail markers when I felt a strange pressure on my chest, a feeling of being watched. I looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation. My flashlight flickered, and I instinctively tightened my grip on the handle. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper. Like the wind itself had spoken. I froze. "Help me?" the voice said, clear as day. I spun around, heart pounding. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. A shadow, human-shaped but blurry. As if it wasn't fully present in the world, I called out to it, but the figure didn't respond. Slowly, it began to fade, as if it was dissolving into the night. That's when I realized. There were things on Mount Washington that couldn't be explained. Things that no one, not even the most experienced ranger, could understand. Something ancient and powerful lurked in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. After that night on Mount Washington, the unsettling feeling didn't fade. In fact, it grew stronger, a persistent weight on my chest, a constant reminder that I was not alone in the wilderness. I tried to tell myself that it was just the stress of the job or the isolation, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something far darker lurking in the depths of those mountains. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the tension in the air was palpable. I tried to ignore it, to go about my duties as usual, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Every step I took on the mountain felt like a trespass into sacred, forbidden territory. As the days wore on, strange things began happening. Things that no ranger, no matter how experienced, could explain. One morning, I was patrolling the ridgeline when I found something I couldn't understand. A series of odd markings had appeared overnight on the rocks. They were circular, etched deeply into the stone, their patterns irregular and unsettling. It was like someone or something had scratched them into the surface with great force. The marks seemed to glow faintly, even in the daylight. I knelt down to inspect them, running my fingers over the strange grooves, and an inexplicable shiver ran down my spine. These weren't the markings of any animal I knew, and I had never seen anything like them during my years on the mountain. The idea that they were man-made seemed impossible. There was no evidence of any human activity in the area. The closest town was miles away, and no one could have come up here without being noticed. But the markings, they were undeniable. They were a message, though I couldn't tell what it was trying to communicate. The next day, I encountered another strange phenomenon. I had just finished a routine check on one of the lower trails when I saw something that made my blood run cold. At first, I thought it was an animal, but it wasn't moving like any animal I had ever seen. It was a shape, a blur at the edge of my vision, always just out of reach. I tried to get closer, but it would vanish the moment I focused on it. The feeling of being stalked returned, stronger this time. I could hear footsteps behind me, though no one was there. Every time I turned around, I found myself facing the trees, empty and silent. But in the distance, there was that same impossible shape, darting from shadow to shadow, just out of view. It was as though the mountain itself was trying to keep me from uncovering whatever secrets it was hiding as the days passed. The occurrences became more frequent and more terrifying. The whispers in the wind grew louder, more distinct, as if they were coming from all directions at once. Sometimes, I would hear my name, carried on the wind, beckoning me to come deeper into the woods. Other times, it would be a voice I didn't recognize, pleading for help, the tone tinged with desperation. The voices weren't just in the wind, though. They echoed in my head, as though they were coming from within, burrowing into my thoughts. Refusing to leave, I couldn't tell anyone. I had tried, but each time I was met with skepticism. Other rangers looked at me as though I had lost my mind. No one else had heard the voices. No one else had seen the strange shadows that flickered at the edges of their vision. Everyone told me the same thing. It was just the isolation, the cold, the fatigue. But I knew better. This wasn't just the result of too much time spent alone in the woods. There was something on Mount Washington, something ancient, something dangerous. And it wasn't just the physical phenomena that were unnerving. As the days wore on, I began to notice subtle changes in myself. I felt more isolated than ever, even though I was surrounded by others in the ranger station. It was as though the mountain was slowly stripping away my sense of self, eroding my connection to the world outside. I was losing track of time, forgetting things I had done just hours earlier. I would wake up in the middle of the night, disoriented, my body stiff with tension. I had always been a man of reason, someone who relied on logic and facts to guide me through life. But as I spent more time on the mountain, I could feel my grip on reality slipping. I started seeing things, shadows moving in the corners of my eyes, figures in the distance that would disappear when I approached. I could no longer tell if I was seeing the truth or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The lines between reality and nightmare were beginning to blur. Then, the disappearances started. It was subtle at first. A hiker would vanish, his last known location somewhere on the lower trails, his car still parked at the trailhead. The search parties would comb through the area, but they never found any trace of him. And when they left, it was as though the man had never existed. No footprints, no sign of struggle, just a gaping hole in the mountain, as if it had swallowed him whole. As more people disappeared, the air around the park grew heavier. Visitors were told to stay away, but that didn't stop some from braving the mountain. Some never returned. Others, those who did make it back, would speak of strange sights and sounds, things they couldn't explain. Figures in the trees, whispers calling out from the fog, lights in the distance that hovered and then disappeared. I began to understand what was happening. Mount Washington was more than just a mountain. It was a trap, a place where the rules of nature no longer applied, where the living and the dead were locked in an eternal struggle, and where the mountain itself seemed to claim anyone who dared venture too far into its depths. That I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake coming here. But now it was too late to turn back. Whatever force was at work on this mountain, whatever ancient power had taken hold, was far more powerful than I had anticipated. And I could feel it drawing closer with each passing day as the eerie events on Mount Washington escalated. My perception of reality began to fracture, and I found myself tangled in a complex web of strange phenomena. The mountain, it seemed, wasn't just a place of danger. It was a labyrinth of forces beyond my comprehension. But the most troubling part of all was the way these events seemed to intertwine with the lives of others around me. One subplot that began to take shape was the growing tension between the rangers and the local community. As I ventured further into the mountain's depths, I started to uncover whispers of long-held secrets among the town's residents. Most of them were too afraid to speak openly, but some hinted at a disturbing history tied to Mount Washington. Legends that spoke of ancient rituals and sacrifices, of strange disappearances dating back to the early settlers. The locals didn't trust the rangers much, and after a few interactions, I began to understand why. They spoke of a growing divide between those who had worked on the mountain for years and the newcomers, like myself, who were driven by curiosity or scientific research. There was a palpable sense of distrust, almost as if the mountain itself had a way of influencing people, manipulating their thoughts and feelings. The rangers, who had once been a close-knit group, were beginning to fracture, some becoming increasingly paranoid, others more withdrawn. The town itself wasn't much better. When I went to the local diner to try and gather information, I noticed how people would stop talking as soon as I entered. Conversations ceased, eyes would avert, and the air became thick with unspoken tension. I could feel that something had happened here long before I set foot on the mountain, something that had left a scar on the people who lived in its shadow. It wasn't until I dug deeper that I learned the town had a grim history. Stories from the past century told of a series of mysterious deaths that had never been fully explained. People found dead on the mountain under strange circumstances. Some were hikers, others were locals, but all had the same chilling story. They had wandered too far, gone too deep, and were never quite the same afterward. That I began to suspect that whatever was happening to me, the strange visions, the unshakable feeling of being watched, had happened to others as well. And what was worse, I feared that these individuals were being marked, pulled into the mountain's grip one by one. There was an unspoken bond between the rangers and the residents, an unacknowledged understanding that something terrible lurked in the wilderness, but no one dared to speak it aloud. They had their own way of coping with the fear, a mixture of avoidance, denial, and fatalism. I was starting to see how deep this darkness ran, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being drawn into it, too. Another subplot I couldn't ignore was the mysterious nature of the disappearances that had begun to plague the area. As I made my way deeper into the woods, I began to notice a disturbing pattern. The missing persons didn't just vanish. They seemed to leave behind traces, hints of their presence that made no sense. An overturned rock here, a broken branch there. Sometimes, the signs seemed to lead in the opposite direction, as if the missing hikers had purposefully retraced their steps, only to be pulled off course again. It was as though the mountain itself was shaping their fate, leading them deeper into its mysteries. "Jake, it's not too late." The words stopped me in my tracks. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I had expected to hear threats, to feel the same overwhelming sense of dread that had gripped me in the forest. But instead, there was only an eerie calmness. For the first time since I had left the mountain, I felt like the weight had lifted, even if just for a moment. That I spent the next few weeks in a quiet, introspective state. I knew I couldn't live in fear forever, and I had no desire to let Mount Washington have the final say in my life. I began taking steps to return to the mountains, not to confront the entity that had tried to consume me, but to find closure. I had to face the place that had forever altered me, to come to terms with what had happened, and to ensure that I would never fall victim to its pull again, that I wasn't the man I had been when I first entered those mountains. I had survived something far darker than I had ever imagined, and it had changed me. But the change wasn't just something to fear. It was a source of strength. I wasn't going to run anymore. I was going to learn to live with the darkness, to push through it, and to emerge stronger. The mountain may have claimed part of me, but it would never take all of me. Not anymore. I was no longer just a ranger. I was someone who had learned to overcome, to adapt, and to grow. And I was going to make sure that whatever happened next, I would face it on my own terms. The days leading up to my return to Mount Washington were filled with an eerie sense of inevitability. I knew what I was about to do could break me, but I also understood that I had no other choice. I had spent weeks trying to outrun my memories, But the truth was that the mountain had already claimed a part of me. It had twisted my very perception of reality. If I were ever to be free, I would have to go back. Not to confront it head-on, but to face what had happened, to reclaim myself from its grip. That I had returned to the small town near the mountain, the place where I had sought refuge after escaping the park. It had taken every ounce of strength to resist the temptation to just leave, to abandon everything and find a new life far from the terror that haunted my nights. But I knew now that running wasn't the answer. I couldn't let the mountain dictate my future. Not anymore. That I spent my time preparing for the inevitable, gathering information, revisiting old maps, and consulting local experts. I made the decision to approach the mountain from a different angle this time. The roads I had taken before had led me into the heart of the chaos, the whispers and the shadows. But there was another route, an old path that skirted the northern edge of the park, far from the station where I had last encountered the darkness. I hoped this path would offer a chance to get closer to the mountain without being consumed by its pull. The first time I tried to talk to anyone about what I had experienced, I was met with dismissive stares. People in the town had heard the rumors, the stories about the park and its strange happenings, the disappearances, the inexplicable events that seemed to linger in the air like a thick fog. But most of them had learned to live with the mountain's dark reputation. It was just part of life. There were certain things about Mount Washington that couldn't be explained, and they didn't want to dwell on them. I couldn't blame them. The more I talked about my experiences, the more I realized that no one could truly understand. No one could feel what I had felt, the crushing weight of something ancient and otherworldly pressing in on you, bending your mind and spirit to its will. The terror had a smell, a sound, a presence that went beyond the physical. It was as if the mountain itself were alive, aware of you, aware of everything that had come before you. I had never believed in the supernatural before, at least not in any meaningful way, but after everything I had seen, I couldn't deny what had been staring me in the face. As the days passed, I took small steps back toward Mount Washington. I visited the local library again, combing through the archives in search of any clue that might give me insight into what I had experienced. I had uncovered old journals and letters written by previous rangers, scientists, and hikers who had ventured too far into the park and never returned. Their accounts were fragmented and vague, but there was a clear pattern. Many of them spoke of feeling watched, of hearing strange sounds in the woods that defied explanation. Some described visions, fleeting glimpses of figures that didn't belong in this world, standing just beyond the trees. On all of these records, one name kept cropping up, the Whispering One. It was always mentioned in hushed tones, as though even the mention of it could bring about its wrath. No one knew exactly what it was, but the stories painted a picture of a presence that had been in the mountains long before anyone had dared to explore them. Some said it was a spirit of an ancient deity that had once ruled the land. Others claimed it was the manifestation of the mountain's own malevolent energy. Whatever it was, it seemed to thrive on fear, and in the deepest recesses of the park, it waited for the unwary to wander into its grasp. That I began preparing physically as well. I knew that no amount of research or mental preparation could protect me from whatever awaited on the mountain. I had to be ready for anything. I started hiking daily, reconditioning my body for the arduous journey ahead. The quiet, open spaces of the surrounding woods were peaceful in comparison to the chaos of the park, but they served as a reminder that I had to be ready for whatever the mountain threw at me. I needed to regain my strength and focus mentally and physically. The stakes were too high for me to fail. By the time I felt ready to return, I had compiled a small collection of survival gear: a flashlight, a compass, a first aid kit, and extra provisions. I couldn't trust the wilderness around Mount Washington. I had learned that the hard way. The mountain had its own rules, and you had to follow them or risk being lost forever. It wasn't just about surviving the terrain. It was about surviving the unseen forces that lay beneath its surface. My final step was to speak to Emily's family. I needed their blessing, their understanding. I had failed her once, and I couldn't leave her behind without trying to make things right. But when I spoke to her parents, I was met with silence. They had heard of the strange happenings, the rumors, but they didn't want to hear anything more. They had lost their daughter, and the last thing they wanted was to confront the truth of what had happened. I couldn't blame them for it, but I couldn't walk away without knowing the full story. With all my preparations in place, I stood on the edge of the mountain, looking up at its imposing peak. The fog swirled around it like a shroud, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me. There was no turning back now. I had come too far. I had faced my fear and accepted the responsibility of knowing the truth, of understanding the darkness that had taken so much from me. As I stood there, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of resolve settle within me. The whispers had started again, distant at first, like a faint murmur on the wind. But they weren't the same whispers from before. They didn't hold the same power over me. I had come to understand them, to face them head-on. They were part of the mountain's story, but they didn't control mine. I took a deep breath, adjusted my pack, and began my ascent. The final chapter of my journey was about to unfold, and I knew that whatever awaited me on Mount Washington, I was ready. The air grew colder the higher I climbed. The familiar feeling of being watched returned, but this time, it wasn't as suffocating. Instead, there was a strange, unsettling calmness to it, as though the mountain itself was waiting for something. The trail was narrow, the rocks uneven beneath my boots, and the trees above me twisted like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. The fog thickened with every step, and the dense silence of the forest weighed heavily on me. The occasional rustle of leaves was the only sound, but it felt distorted, as though the very air around me had thickened and I had learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts told me that something was about to happen. The deeper I ventured into the park, the more vivid the memories of that first terrible encounter with the Whispering One became. The air was charged with the same oppressive energy, the same malevolent presence that I had felt before. It was like walking in the shadow of something ancient, something that had lived for centuries beneath the surface of the mountain. Every step felt like I was encroaching upon its territory. One disappearance that stood out to me was that of a fellow ranger, Emily, who had been working alongside me. She was an experienced guide, sharp and resourceful, but she had been slowly becoming more distant. She claimed to have seen things, sights that couldn't be explained, figures that watched from the shadows. At first, I thought she was just succumbing to the same paranoia that had gripped me, but when she disappeared one night without a trace, I started to wonder if there was more to her claims than I had initially believed. In the days leading up to her disappearance, I had noticed Emily acting strangely. She would leave the ranger station at odd hours, making vague excuses for her absences. Sometimes, she'd return with no explanation for where she had been. I had dismissed it as stress or exhaustion, but now, I couldn't help but wonder if the mountain was getting to her, too. There had been moments when I thought I saw her watching me from afar. Her eyes wide with a look of terror I couldn't shake. That it wasn't just Emily's disappearance that kept me up at night. There was also the growing realization that the force at work on Mount Washington might be older, far older, than anything I could have ever imagined. In my research, I discovered records of strange sightings, recorded by Native American tribes in the area. They spoke of a powerful spirit, a guardian of the mountain that was said to demand respect and reverence. But as the years went on, the stories grew darker. The spirit was no longer seen as a protector, but as a malevolent force, one that could twist the minds of those who came too close. The rituals and sacrifices that the settlers had performed, some to appease the spirit, others to exploit its power, had left an indelible mark on the land, a mark that could never be erased. I began to connect the dots. Emily's disappearance, the strange sightings and whispers in the wind, the missing hikers, the mysterious markings on the rocks. It all pointed to one thing. The mountain was alive, its hunger insatiable, its power growing stronger with each passing day. But no one could escape it. Not the rangers, not the townspeople, and certainly not me. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming. The mountain was not just a place to fear. It was a force that had embedded itself deep within the landscape, a force that was now making its presence known in ways I couldn't comprehend. As I faced the truth, I knew that there would be no easy way out. The day I realized the full scope of what was happening on Mount Washington was the day I saw Emily again. But this time, she wasn't the ranger I had worked alongside. She wasn't even the person I thought I knew. She was something else. Something far darker and more twisted. It all began in the dead of night. The winds had picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of wailing spirits. The air was thick with fog, so dense it felt like walking through a wall of cotton. The visibility was near zero. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. I had decided to go out searching for Emily, knowing in my gut that something had gone terribly wrong. But what I didn't know was how wrong things were about to get. That I heard her first. A soft whisper carried on the wind. My name. Just a whisper, but it was enough to make me freeze in my tracks. Jake. The voice called again, barely audible, yet unmistakable. It was Emily's voice. At least it sounded like it, but it was wrong. The tone was hollow, as though it were coming from somewhere deep within the mountain itself. I couldn't explain it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt as if the very earth beneath me was shifting, and that I wasn't alone out there. Emily, I called out into the darkness, my voice barely rising above the wind. Is that you? The whisper came again, but now there was an edge to it. Come closer, Jake. It's safe. I'm waiting. I knew I should have turned back, but something inside me urged me forward. Perhaps it was the sense of guilt, the nagging feeling that I had abandoned my colleague. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something more primal, urging me to uncover the truth. So, I pushed through the fog, each step becoming more difficult, as though the air itself was thickening with every breath. And then I saw her. It was Emily, standing in the middle of the trail, shrouded in mist. But something was wrong. Her eyes were wide and vacant, her face pale, almost ashen, like she hadn't seen the sun in years. She stood motionless, her body trembling slightly, her arms hanging at her sides. There was no warmth in her expression. No recognition. Just emptiness. Emily, what happened to you? I asked, taking a tentative step toward her. She didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head slightly to the side, and then a chilling smile spread across her face. But this smile was nothing like the friendly, reassuring one I remembered. It was unnerving, twisted, as though it had been carved into her face by something otherworldly. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words that escaped were not hers. It is too late, Jake, the voice said, distorted and guttural, coming from deep within her throat. You've already made your choice. You're part of it now. My blood ran cold. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away from her as possible. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The air seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy, and for the first time, I realized that Emily, whatever was left of her, was no longer in control. She was being controlled by something far older, something that had taken hold of her and now sought to claim me as well. The ground beneath my feet shifted again, but this time it wasn't just the wind. It was the mountain itself, its pulse reverberating through the earth, calling to me. The same whispers I had heard earlier now grew louder, echoing in my ears. Join us, Jake, they beckoned. You belong here. We all do. Emily, I shouted, stepping back. Fight it. This isn't you. But there was no response. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. As she moved, I noticed something strange. Her body was changing, shifting, as if it were being pulled apart at the seams. Her skin began to crack, splitting open like old bark, revealing something beneath. There was no flesh. There was only darkness, a swirling mass of shadows and tendrils that reached toward me like hungry hands. In that moment, I understood the full horror of what had happened to her, and to so many others who had ventured too far into the mountain's depths. The force that resided within the earth, the one that had begun to consume Emily, was far more than a mere legend. It was real, and it had been waiting dormant for years, feeding on the souls of the curious, the brave, the foolish. But as the darkness in Emily's body reached for me, something inside me snapped. The fear, the confusion, the overwhelming urge to run, they all vanished in an instant. Instead, I felt something else, something deep and visceral, a will to survive. I couldn't let this force claim me as it had claimed Emily. I couldn't let it take over my mind, my body, my soul. With a final, desperate effort, I turned and ran. My legs moved faster than they ever had before, pumping with an adrenaline I didn't know I had. The mountain seemed to resist me, the earth pushing against my feet, as though it didn't want me to leave. But I ran anyway, knowing that if I didn't, I would be lost to it forever. I made it back to the ranger station, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door behind me, barricading myself inside. As I looked out the window, the fog still clung to the trees, but Emily was gone. The mountain, however, still loomed silent. Waiting.it wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but I had escaped for now. And that knowledge, however small, was enough to give me the strength to face what lay ahead. The ranger station was silent. The sound of my ragged breath was the only thing breaking the oppressive stillness. My hands shook uncontrollably, and my heart felt like it was hammering against my chest. I couldn't get the image of Emily's face out of my mind. The hollow eyes, the unnatural smile, the feeling of the mountain pressing in on me, suffocating me with its ancient, malevolent power. The whispering voices still echoed in my head, distant yet deafening. I slumped against the wall, my mind racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. It was all too much to process. I had been so sure that the stories, the rumors, the strange occurrences in the area were just that, stories, legends. But now, faced with the undeniable truth, I couldn't deny the horror I had witnessed. The thing that had taken Emily, it wasn't just some wild animal or a freak accident. It was something older, something far more dangerous. The mountain itself, or whatever force resided within it, had consumed her. And it wasn't finished. If anything, it had only just begun. I tried to steady myself, but the reality of what I had just escaped started to sink in. I had seen Emily change, her body transforming into something unrecognizable. The shadowy tendrils that had reached for me were not just a physical manifestation of her transformation. They were something more. They were a sign of the mountain's power, of the force that lurked beneath the surface, waiting to claim more victims. The mountain had claimed Emily. What was to stop it from claiming me too? I had seen the way the earth shifted underfoot, the way it seemed to pull me toward it, as if I were already part of its dark, insidious web. The whispering voices, the pull toward the depths. It wasn't just a hallucination. It was real, and it had marked me. I staggered to the small window and peered out, trying to make sense of the fog that still lingered over the landscape. There was something unsettling about the way the mist swirled. It was as if the mountain was alive, breathing, shifting in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. But I couldn't stay here. The longer I remained in the station, the more the mountain's presence seemed to weigh on me, pressing in on every side. I had to leave, but where would I go? There was nowhere to hide from something like this. I tried to call the authorities, other rangers, anyone who could help, but there was no signal. The mountain had swallowed all traces of communication, leaving me cut off from the world. It was just me and the darkness that awaited. And then the whispers came again, louder this time, filling my ears with a cold, malicious promise. Asterisk, asterisk, you belong here now, Jake. You are one with us. The mountain has claimed you. The voice was unmistakable. It was Emily, or what was left of her. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The mountain wasn't just a place of ancient, supernatural power. It was a living entity, a force that could possess, consume, and control anyone who stepped too far into its domain. I was terrified. Terrified of what I had witnessed. Terrified of what I might still be hearing. But a small, flickering flame of defiance burned deep within me. I wasn't going to let this thing, whatever it was, take me the way it had taken Emily. She had been lost. I refused to become another one of its victims. I grabbed my gear and made a snap decision. I had to leave Mount Washington. I couldn't fight whatever force was out there on my own, but I could try to escape. I had to find a way back to the world beyond this cursed place. I knew the moment I stepped out of the station, the mountain would be watching me, but I didn't care anymore. With my heart racing and my thoughts a blur, I grabbed the keys to the truck parked outside. The fog was thickening again, swirling like a living creature, but I didn't hesitate. I opened the door and stepped outside as I made my way to the truck. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The whispering voices were louder now, and they weren't just in my head. They seemed to echo from the trees themselves, from the very ground beneath me. The mountain wasn't just waiting for me. It was closing in. I started the engine and drove. The road ahead was treacherous, winding through dense forest and steep cliffs, but I didn't care. I focused only on getting out. The mountain loomed behind me, its towering presence a constant reminder of the horrors it held. I wasn't sure if I would make it out. I wasn't even sure if I had truly escaped, but I had to try. Hours passed in a blur of fog and fear. The landscape shifted around me, but I couldn't seem to escape the feeling of being watched. The further I drove, the more oppressive the atmosphere seemed, as though the mountain had cast its shadow over everything. But eventually, as the morning light began to break through the mist, I saw the road open up ahead, leading me back to civilization. I hadn't escaped unscathed, though. The whispers had followed me, lingering in the back of my mind. I could feel the weight of their presence, as though something was still tethering me to that cursed place. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't outrun it forever. The world had changed for me in ways I couldn't fully understand. I had been marked by the mountain, and even though I had made it out, I knew that I could never truly escape the pull of its darkness. I didn't know what had happened to me during those hours of driving through the fog, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. The deeper I got away from Mount Washington, the more the whispers faded, but they never truly stopped. It was as though a part of the mountain had attached itself to me, an unseen weight, a haunting presence that refused to let go. I could still feel it lurking behind me, hovering just out of sight, waiting for the moment when it could claim me as it had claimed others before. But despite the relentless pull of the mountain, something within me began to shift. The fear, the overwhelming terror that had crippled me at first, began to take on a different shape. It became fuel. I couldn't explain why, but I knew that I wasn't just running away anymore. I was surviving, and surviving meant adapting, evolving, finding a way to face whatever had been awakened within me. I didn't speak to anyone for days. I didn't even let myself think about the details of what had happened. Every time I let my mind wander back to the station, to Emily's face as it twisted into something grotesque, the shadowy presence lurking in the trees, I felt the pull, the suffocating darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. I'd been a ranger, and I had believed in my ability to read nature, to understand it. But what I had encountered at Mount Washington wasn't natural. It wasn't a force I could fight with training or logic. I went to the nearest town, a small place nestled in the foothills of the mountains. The locals gave me strange looks, probably because I looked like I had seen a ghost, which in some sense I had. I checked into a small motel, hoping for some semblance of normalcy. But there was no escaping what had happened. Even in the quiet of my room, the whispers seemed to cling to me, slipping between the cracks of the walls and into my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mount Washington was still there, pressing in on me. That I spent the next few days researching. I scoured old records, newspaper clippings, anything I could find about the area, trying to piece together some kind of understanding of what I had experienced. It was hard to find any concrete answers. Many of the records were sparse, fragmented, but there were consistent patterns. The stories about Mount Washington were ancient, passed down from generation to generation. Local legends spoke of a dark entity, an ancient force tied to the mountain itself, that preyed on anyone who ventured too far into its domain. It was said to trap people, break them down mentally and physically, until they became part of the mountain, absorbed into its energy, its essence. The more I read, the more I felt the ground beneath me shift. I wasn't just learning about the mountain, I was learning about myself. The past few days had forced me to confront something I hadn't wanted to admit. I had changed. Something inside me had cracked open at Mount Washington, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The fear, the terror that had once paralyzed me, it had become part of my story now. I had to face it, or I would be consumed by it. That I began taking long walks, trying to reestablish some sense of control over my mind and body. The mornings were the hardest. The fog still clung to the mountains like a heavy blanket, and every step I took seemed to echo with the weight of what I had left behind. But I pushed through it. I knew that if I let myself linger in the past, I would never escape to end those walks. I found something unexpected: strength. The whispers were still there, but they weren't as loud. I could hear them, but they no longer controlled me. I wasn't letting the fear dictate my every move anymore. I was learning how to silence the noise, how to tune out the relentless pull of the mountain. I didn't know how I had done it, but somehow I was reclaiming myself. The turning point came one night when I couldn't sleep. I had been staring at the ceiling, trying to block out the memories, when I heard a sound, soft at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder. It was the voice of Emily, but this time it was different. There was no malice in it. It was quiet, distant, like an echo from the past. She spoke to me, not in the harsh tones I had heard before, but in a calm, almost peaceful way. At the base of the mountain, the sound of rushing water from the nearby stream had provided a comforting background noise. But here, in the heart of the park, there was only silence. My flashlight flickered as I moved forward, and I quickly checked the batteries, hoping it wasn't a sign of something more ominous. The thought of being lost in the dark, with no light to guide me, sent a shiver down my spine. But I pushed the fear aside. I had come too far to turn back now. The whispers began again, but this time they weren't in my head. They were around me, drifting on the wind, just out of reach. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the words, but they were fragmented, like a broken radio signal. Leave. You're not supposed to. It's not what you think. I ignored them. I had heard it all before, the threats, the confusion, the warning, but I had no intention of leaving. I had to know the truth, no matter the cost. And then I saw it first. I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow in the distance, barely visible through the mist. But as I approached, the shape became clearer. It was a figure tall, indistinct, with an almost human form. It stood at the edge of the trail, just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. Its features were hazy, flickering in and out of focus, like something that didn't belong in this world. But there was no mistaking the way it seemed to be watching me. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't want to approach it, but I knew I had to. This was it, the moment I had been dreading, the moment I had come back for. I had to confront the creature that had haunted my dreams, the presence that had taken Emily, the presence that had been lying in wait all these years. That I took a step forward, my legs feeling heavy, as if the mountain itself was trying to pull me back. The fog thickened around me, swallowing the trail, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The figure remained stationary, almost as if it was waiting for me to make the first move. "Emily?" I whispered, almost involuntarily. The name felt like a prayer, a plea for some kind of sign, some indication that I wasn't alone in this moment. But the figure didn't respond. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just waited. The whispers returned, louder this time, almost deafening in their intensity. They were no longer fragmented. They were clear, directed at me, pulling at my thoughts, my resolve. Leave now, and you will be free. You don't have to face this. But I wasn't gonna back down. Not again. I had come here to understand, to uncover the truth, to take back the pieces of my life that had been stolen by this place. I had spent years running from this moment, but now I had no choice but to face it. "You're not in control here," I muttered to myself, as much to calm my nerves as to assert some sort of dominance over the situation. But I knew deep down that control was an illusion. The mountain had a power of its own, and I was only a small part of a much larger, much darker story. I had always been just a visitor, a trespasser. I took another step forward, and then it happened. The figure moved. In an instant, it was no longer standing still. It was rushing toward me, its shape becoming more distinct, more terrifying. It was no longer a shadow. It was a presence, an embodiment of all the darkness I had feared. Its face, if it could even be called that, was like a swirling mass of shadows and light, constantly shifting, never forming anything solid, anything recognizable. And yet, It had eyes, two glowing orbs that seemed to pierce through the fog, through my very soul that I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My heart raced as I felt an overwhelming surge of fear wash over me. This was it. The mountain had claimed me, just as it had claimed Emily, just as it had claimed everyone else who had come too close. There was no escaping it now. I was its next victim. But then, in the split second before it reached me, I felt something. A surge of energy, a burst of light ripple through the air. It wasn't from me. It was from the mountain itself. The creature faltered, its form flickering like a candle about to burn out. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, that the mountain's hold on me had finally cracked. But the truth was, I had reached the breaking point. The mountain would either destroy me, or I would destroy it. The moment hung in the air, frozen, as if the world itself had paused to witness the clash between the living and the unnatural. I stood there, my body shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps, unsure if I was still alive or if I had already crossed over into some other realm. The creature loomed before me, its eyes burning with a cold, unearthly fire. I could feel its malevolent energy pushing against my chest, trying to force me into submission. But something inside me, something that had been dormant for years, was awakening. The light surged again, brighter this time, as if the very essence of the mountain was pushing back against the darkness. The air around me grew warm, and the fog parted for a fleeting moment, revealing the landscape beyond. In that brief instant, I saw the vastness of the forest, the towering peaks of Mount Washington, and the intricate web of nature that had always existed, long before I had set foot here. It was a reminder, this place was bigger than any one man or any single moment of terror. It had always been part of something much older, much more profound. That I remembered the stories the elders had told me as a child, about the ancient forces that roamed these lands, the spirits that had long since faded into legend, and the strange balance that had to be maintained. What I had thought was a curse, a malicious entity hunting me, was part of that balance, a keeper of the old ways, bound to protect the secrets of the mountain. The creature's form flickered again, a shape-shifting mass of shadows and light, and I realized with a chilling clarity, it wasn't trying to kill me. It was trying to stop me from uncovering something deeper, something that could shatter the fragile equilibrium of the world. It was a force of preservation, not destruction. But it had become twisted, corrupted by time, and by the very secrets it was meant to guard. That I end that moment, I made a decision with a forceful breath. I raised my arms, not in defense, but in surrender. I wasn't trying to fight the creature. I was surrendering to the mountain, to the forces that I could no longer comprehend. I had to let go of my fear, my need for control, and accept that I wasn't meant to understand everything. The creature hesitated, its form wavering as if confused by my unexpected response. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it began to dissipate. The darkness that had once threatened to consume me retreated, and the mountain returned to its eerie silence. I stood alone, once again on the trail. The air was still cold, but the oppressive weight had lifted. My heart pounded in my chest, but it was no longer with fear. It was with the knowledge that I had survived, that I had faced something far beyond the comprehension of any scientist, any man. The secrets of Mount Washington had revealed themselves to me, and while I may never fully understand them, I now knew my place in the grander scheme of things. That I couldn't say if I had truly conquered the mountain, or if it had simply allowed me to walk away. But I knew that the truth had changed me, just as the mountain had changed all those who dared to venture into its depths. With a heavy heart and a mind full of questions, I turned and walked away, the mountain's whispers fading into the distance behind me. Years have passed since that fateful day on Mount Washington, and I've never spoken of it to anyone, not in detail. The world continues to turn, and I return to my life as a scientist, but something inside me has irrevocably shifted. I still feel the mountain's presence in my dreams, its secrets echoing in my mind. The research I once sought to uncover has been lost to me, buried beneath the weight of that encounter. I've come to accept that some truths are too dangerous to know, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. But I'll never forget. If you've ever experienced something you couldn't explain, something that left you questioning the very fabric of reality, share your story. Dive deeper into the unknown, and remember, you're never truly alone in your search for answers. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling tales that will keep you questioning what's real. Do you dare to uncover more of what lies hidden in the shadows? Click here to watch the next episode and join the journey into the mysteries that lurk just beyond our understanding. The truth is out there. If you're ready,